All right, so we're in Photoshop and we're playing with some of the type tools. And you see that as soon as you use the type tool, it creates a big T within the layer window icon. As if you double click that T, it will automatically select everything in that type, but you can also individually select different letters. So for instance, if I want the kerning, the space between the letters, between this W and E a little bit closer, I can just select those two and then hold down Option and use my arrow keys. And I can shrink it. This is the type setting. Or between the Y and the O. And I can shrink it. Notice it's not changing the kerning around the rest, right? And then if I want to change this apostrophe, maybe I want a different typeface for it because I don't really like that apostrophe design. So in the options, I can also do that. And I'm going to choose a type of typeface, right? So these are the classes. There's serif type, there's slab serif type. That's what this is. There's sans serif, which means what we call a modern typeface. It doesn't have any decorative ends to it. That's like what my D is. There's script, which is difficult to typeset with because it has to connect to itself, right? There's monospace, where it's always an exact even space between. There's handwritten, which is what this is closer to. There's black letter, which is old Gothic type, used to be called Gothic. And then there's decorative. So if I look at handwritten, that's kind of the quality I'm going for here. Then these are some of the typefaces they have that I can choose from that are already designed. These are all just vectors. And maybe I like Comic Sans for just the apostrophe, which is kind of an old joke, often belittled type. Or I'll do Bradley hand bold. Okay, but the problem with it is it's too small in that typeface. So then I'm going to make it a much bigger point size, like maybe 140. There we go. And then I'm going to deselect off of it so I can see it. And you can see how the hand typeface is intentionally kind of wavy, whereas the rest is really clean. And then if I want to mess with the kerning, even though they're different typefaces, I'm just going to click on that apostrophe, select that, and then use Option and shrink it. All right. And then I can shrink it on both sides. So I can do all of this kind of spacing. If I want to give it different effects, I can try that. I can try to play with not having it italicized, which helps, right? Yeah, so all of this is gonna help. So italics can sometimes really mess with the kerning. And you can even just use it on the space between things. Okay, so now that I've got that kind of spacing worked out, maybe I can use the tools within Photoshop. This is called the arc tool for warping your text. And I want to do it not as an arc like this, not as an arc that's only arced on the bottom, not as an arc that's only arced on the top, not as a bulge, right? Not as a shell, which is kind of interesting. But the closest thing is going to be a wave, right, to what I have. And that allows me to play with the distortion and the amount of bend in it. But that's a little bit different than what I'm envisioning, right? So I can play with all these different options. But ultimately, I might just individually place each of those type examples. So how close can I get? Well, I'm going to do that by doing the wave. Or maybe actually this one, the rise. And let's see if that bend is enough. No, it's not. All right, never mind. So it's going to be the wave. And then really bend it quite a bit. And then play with these distortions. So it's a little bit thinner at the front than it is, or taller at the front than it is at the end. And then it's a little tilted. So that's pretty close, but notice how it doesn't really match what I want. And then I can always just do Command T in the typical way without it being selected and stretch it and even do things like skew it and warp it. Right? Which is pretty impressive. And then, of course, if I rasterize it, I can have even more options. Because right now it's still a vector. So how do I rasterize it? I make a duplicate, I right-click, I say rasterize type, and now it's just pixels that I can treat as though they're my own drawing. So then I can warp it separately in different places. I can even, and this is something I've done with type design, modifying existing typefaces, I can even use puppet warp, which is a little daunting, but that gives you really full control, right? So if I want to enlarge my O, that allows me to place it individually and then stretch it and tilt it and move it right where I want it. But of course, you got to plot your points and then set them, where you want them. Okay, I'm showing you this in Photoshop so I can also show you it in Illustrator, because the goal is to get vector type. And the whole point is to make it all intentional. So that's how you can do it in Photoshop. And if you are happy with all of that in Photoshop with existing typefaces, then you turn off everything else. And you save this as a PNG. I'm not happy with it. I'm going to show you, but just to show you, I'm going to do mine in Illustrator. I call it a test file to the desktop, and I save it as a copy and as a PNG. Right? And then how do we turn it into a vector? We open it up. There it is in Adobe Illustrator, just like we did with our logo sketch or our line art. You're getting lots of practice at vectorizing. And then I select it. With the large selection tool, I make sure it fits on the artboard. And I go to Properties. And I go to Image Trace, and I choose Black and White Logo. So even if you had some color in here, this would strip it out. And then I go to the Advanced Options, and I say Ignore the color. And then I say Expand. And now I have it as a vector. Both my hand-drawn type, which is outlined, and my modified, chosen typeface. Now, because it's a vector, that gives me a lot of individual control. So I can use the small selection tool, and I can move each letter where I want it. But as long as I can see those anchor points, I can also redraw it using my favorite tool, the pencil tool. I'm going to set it to be pretty smooth. I'm going to use my tablet. And as long as I'm start on the path and end on the path, I can clean it up and turn these, like my apostrophe got way too long there, but you see how it got smoothed out. And then I can also use the small selection tool and move it into place. So Illustrator is a wonderful type design tool. Think of it as designing logo types. If I want to shrink this opening in the R, I can do that, right? If I want to raise the lift here, I can do that. So this is using an existing typeface and modifying it. And then by doing it this way, there are lots of other options besides just the typefaces that are in Photoshop. So I'm going to close this because instead of using that typeface, I like my text blocking sketch. And so I'm just going to keep that along with the way I divide it. And then I'm going to save this as a test file. Remember, it's 16 by 20, but I have the backgrounds turned off. And you know what? I can even have the backgrounds turned on, and it would be fine. So I'm going to say File, now, Save As. First of all, my name, assignment number 6. Because I haven't actually saved it out of Photoshop yet, as a PSD file. And then a description, text design. And then I can just save this as a PNG or as a JPEG, something that's online, a format. And I can post this to Canvas in the assignment as my type blocking, right? My text blocking sketch. But then I can also open it in Illustrator, and I'll show you how you can do these type design tools in Illustrator, just like we can in Photoshop. So where is it? There it is. Oh, that's my PSD. Here's my PNG. I got to make a folder for it. Put it in the folder. Organization never becomes less important for your files, especially as we start putting together our final portfolios. And I'm going to grab this because I'll accept any format that you give me your blocking sketch in. But I want to know that you have a plan before you start making your vector type. Just like we sketched our logos out ahead of time. Okay. Now to get clean type, like my inspiration there, we're going to open this file with Adobe Illustrator. So when we open it with Illustrator, I'm not going to turn it into a vector. I'm using this as a sketch in which to make vector type. So I'm going to shrink it. Whoops. In Illustrator, you got to hold down Shift and Option to shrink it without it losing proportion. As long as it fits on the artboard, I'm good. Now I'm going to go to its layer and right-click on that layer to onion skin it, to dim it. And I'm going to dim this even more than 50%. I'm going to dim it 70%. Maybe even more than that. I think this is in reverse. So to 30%. There we go. And then I'm going to lock that layer and create a new layer in Illustrator, just like we did when we were making our logos. And now I'm going to try the type tools in Illustrator. So the T, right? Notice you have the type tool. You have a beautiful tool called Type on Path, which is going to work really well for mine. And then we have a vertical type tool. I'm going to use a standard type tool for the I and the D. I'm just going to click, and you'll see how small it is. Double click on it, and make a capital I. Now, how do I make it big? Well, you go to that vector layer, and you select it. And then we have to go to the properties to see the type options. And the first one we have is the point size. So this is going to be